for everybody that is joining us, and I know we'll have folks coming on board in the next couple of minutes here. Today's discussion is a topic that frankly is one of the underbellies of most security and governance programs, how we look at credentials, how we manage them well, how we agree various systems of record. It is not for the weak of heart, and I am absolutely thrilled to have Connor here with us from Clarity Security. He's going to be giving us a really interesting and frankly a very high-level review of credential management from a variety of different perspectives. And so without too much further ado, Connor, I'd like to hand over the mic to you. I will mute myself, which is a great blessing for everyone else online. And we'll start off.
Awesome. Give me just 1 second. Cool. So thanks, Matt and Saul and Dave for the opportunity today. So as you said, my name is Connor Borchgrevink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Clarity Security. But if we step back a couple of months, this is actually my very first time on the vendor side of the house. I spent a vast majority of my professional career up to this point working my way through the trenches of cybersecurity. In my most recent role, I served as a security architect for a medical device manufacturer, where I manned every station from a security analyst to driving governance, risk, and compliance. And in that time is where I gained a vast majority of my experience in the thrilling world of IT audit, and by extension, where I met and subsequently became friends with Matt and Saul. So very, very quick agenda of what I'm gonna go over today is 2 brief crash courses over FISMA and NIST, a fun story, and then address some common questions and challenges associated with identity, credential, and access management, and how we suggest overcoming them. So I wanted to start with a crash course over FISMA and NIST to really contextualize what I'm going to be talking about today and give a strong framework of identity, credential, and access management. So for those who are unaware, FISMA 2014 is the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014. It was an update on FISMA 2002 with a few key changes. It reestablished the Office of Management and Budget as an authority figure. It established the Department of Homeland Security as the authority to administer and implement security practices and policies across the federal government. It established requirements for the federal agencies to submit notifications of security incidents to Congress. And finally, it required every agency within the federal government to do an independent evaluation of the effectiveness of their security program, and that must be published online for everybody to read. So the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency published reporting metrics based on NIST 853 in the cybersecurity framework. And so as such, it kind of breaks down security into 5 functional areas, which are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And each of these functional areas are rated on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. And FISMA stipulates that all agencies, in order to be compliant, has to be a 4 or a 5 to be compliant. So if we take a look into the protect functional area, FISMA and NIST breaks it down into 3 categories, which are configuration management, identity management, and security and training. And double clicking into the topic of the presentation and what we do at Clarity Security, identity and access management is broken down into 3 categories, which are identity and credential management, permission management, and access. So each of these has 8 metrics they are evaluated on, and they're tied directly and indirectly to NIST controls. And for what I'm talking about, right, the center column is the FISMA control, and then the far right column is all the NIST controls each item is tied to. So before I go forward, I want to mention that there's a lot more nuance to all of this, and I'm trying to just give a quick crash course. So it's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio between FISMA and NIST, right? FISMA metrics are based on playbooks, publications from SANS, FIPS, DHS, and more. So but at its core, right, FISMA is based on NIST 853. So moving on to the final crash course, which is on NIST. I'm not going to spend nearly as much time, but NIST 853 is the publication that provides a catalog of all security and privacy controls that should be used and implemented by the federal government and its various agencies and contractors and those who work with it. So the NIST cybersecurity framework, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is a subsection of the controls listed in NIST 853, but with one major downside, that highly regulated environments such as companies that have PCI or HIPAA regulations will likely have to bolt on additional requirements and additional matrices items. So for example, if you want to be PCI compliant, you have to add on PCI 2.1, 8.1, et cetera, et cetera. But luckily, for most organizations, regulatory agencies really, really want you to achieve compliance. They don't want to have everyone on earth be uncompliant because that doesn't really solve anything. So as such, all of these organizations like PCI will publish the NIST cybersecurity framework with the additional controls you need to add in order to be PCI compliant. So with that out of the way, I want to start with a really quick story that may sound familiar to many of you or cause flashbacks for some of you. So we have a new company, Acme Security and Technology Services. They're a small MSP that provides a really niche security service, and they just signed their very first federal contract. And as such, they're required to launch into a FISMA audit. And after weeks of evaluations, interviews, and assessments, the KPMG write-up landed on the desk of the CISO, and much to the surprise of the Acme team, KPMG assessed that of all 66 metrics, 32 were level 1, 19 were 2, and 15 were 3, which gives them a weighted average of 1.74, which means they were well short of the line to gain at 4. And as the CISO was reading through the report, he finally reached the section, Protect Identity and Access Management, followed by the words, Acme's user identity and access management controls are ill-defined or absent. There is no ICAM strategy, and the processes in place do not ensure privileged and non-privileged identity management. So with this, the leadership team sits back, shocked and confused as to how they got themselves into this situation. So they write these questions that I'm sure many of you have asked yourselves before is, right, where do we start? This is a huge elephant. Where do we start eating? How do we go forward? What is the finish line? Do we have to be perfect, right? Should we go dump millions of dollars into this problem, right? All these questions are just circulating around. And unsurprisingly, right, this feeling of dread is not a unique experience. For many organizations, the philosophy around identity, credential, and access management has long been a strong password policy and a VPN for remote access is more than enough to secure the environment. As we all know, this is not the case, and their audit showed them this is not the case. So obviously it cannot be stated enough that achieving compliance in general is difficult, but identity, credential, and access management is such a difficult problem for organizations to solve that even the federal government and its various agencies are unable to achieve compliance. To evidence this further, we went and pulled 15 FISMA audits for 15 very notable government agencies. And I would like to draw your attention to the upper right-hand corner that is in blue. Those are the only 3 of the 15 that were deemed to be compliant within an identity and access management. The other 12 are out of compliance. And as you can see, a majority of them have miles to go to reach the end state. And as much as I would love to sit and talk about the shortcomings of the federal government, all the deficiencies, the downfalls, and how they're not doing security right, we've selected a few lowlights for a quick comedic break. So the Department of Transportation's report starts with a very succinct line: the DOT's controls over identity and access management are inadequate. The Consumer Product Safety Commission takes it a little step further, where they completely missed the boat. Per Williams-Adley, the CPSC has not developed an ICAM strategy that includes roles and responsibilities, reviews of practices, or working procedures such as identification and authentication. And finally, my personal favorite is the National Credit Union Administration, by policy, requires users to be disabled within 4 hours of their last day of employment. However, they were found to be disabling these accounts anywhere between 4 days and 5 months after their last day of employment. So, right, this seems to be a huge lift, right? For many, it seems like it's an astronomical task, a heavy lift, impossible ask to become compliant within identity management. And on the surface, right, that seems to be the case. You need a substantial investment by the business. You need thousands of man hours, and you need a complete overhaul of the security program to move the needle from a 2 to a 4. And I know I'm not the first to say it, but those notions cannot be further from the truth. We have found that if companies and organizations are willing to be honest with themselves, answer a few questions in an honest manner, and follow a few recommendations, they can be on their way without a $15 million budget, without a team of 30 engineers, or without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. So, right, what are these mythical questions? We found that 3 main questions you need to be able to answer are: did we fail by 1 point, or did we fail by 100? Should we go with a framework, or just try to follow the letter of the law with a specific regulation? And finally, how do we move from a 2 to a 4? So first core question being, did we lose by 1 point or 100? And what I mean by that is, if we look at the weighted average scoring of FISMA, company needs a 4, right? So if a company has a 1 or a 3.9, both are technically out of compliance, but the 3.9 is much closer and likely only needs to fix 1 or 2 things. 1.0 obviously has a very long road ahead of them. So we go back to the question of 1 versus 100. Most of the auditors on this call will say something like Saul did, which is it's pass fail and you fail. And the CISOs who are on this call will probably say, no, the auditors are blowing this way out of proportion. We're not that poor off. And any executives who are not necessarily involved with security are probably incredibly overwhelmed and looking for the Scotch bottle to try to understand what's going on. So, like many things, the truth often lies in the middle, but right, where is that middle? And more often than not, we see that organizations, just like the federal government, are much further from compliant than they really want to admit to themselves. And this isn't to say that they're asleep at the wheel, or they have no controls, or they have a terrible program. It's a stark reminder that the demands of security are ever growing. And to evidence that further, in the early 2000s, our top security fears were worms and malware and some basic attacks. So if you could find a way to deal with the Morris worm, or I love you, or my doom, right? You were amazing. You were miles ahead of the game. And then by the early 2000s, or the late 2000s, early 2010s, you had to have a really good IDS in place to deal with Zeus, the botnets, Trojan, right? So kind of more advanced malware. But if you had a good IDS, again, you were in a great place. And then 2015 rolls around, and MITRE comes out with their very first attack model, where they start identifying additional threats people need to pay attention to. And this is when, right, this ransomware explosion started. Coordinated efforts between hacking groups, malicious groups, all started coming out of the woodwork and trying to intentionally go after companies. And now in 2021, I don't need to say it because everyone knows it, the threat landscape is incredibly vast. Organizations are having to pay attention to everything from simple malware to cross-site scripting on their home pages to insider threats. And right, to put the cherry on top, the MITRE framework itself has nearly doubled in size since its original publication date, and now sits with 245 enterprise threat techniques with thousands of sub-techniques that companies need to be able to figure out how to deal with. So after the initial shock of receiving that 1.7 on a FISMA audit, or a significant deficiency or material weakness in your SOX audit, I just want to say, stay calm, right? This isn't the end of your career or a termination notice, but instead an opportunity to start fresh and build something the right way. And I can speak from personal experience here. When Matt came in and evaluated my security program when I very first started, and we were evaluated at a sub 2 on the NIST cybersecurity maturity model, we leveraged that view to our benefit and improved communication with the executive leadership team, and it helped us align to a security framework that ultimately became the guiding force to the security program and really opened our eyes to see the changes that truly needed to be made. So this leads me into my 3 recommendations, which are: don't panic, take a step back and breathe, and realize that the write-up, even if it's harsh and you got a 1.7, there will be pointed feedback and pointed and strong remediation recommendations that you should be able to leverage immediately. And then, right, you should take those recommendations and launch into a comprehensive gap analysis that doesn't just look at compliance, but the security program, and by extension, the identity program as a whole, and identify areas that can be, right, created if there aren't any there, automated, and then optimized, which I'll get more into shortly. My second recommendation is use this as an opportunity to improve communication between the teams. So one of the unintentional outcomes of a poor performance on an audit or a ransomware event is the amount of visibility it brings into the security program. And with that visibility introduces a whole lot of new parties to the conversation. And most CISOs will say, this is adding too many cooks to the kitchen and this is completely unnecessary. But I am here to say that that's not necessarily the truth. Instead, you can see this as an ability to take charge of the situation and have everybody be on the same page. And you can build specific recommendations and suggestions that the organization can be bettered by. So for example, if there's a deficiency around timely terminations, like the National Credit Union Administration, it's likely due to a breakdown in the communication between HR and IT. So once HR is brought in, right, as opposed to starting to point fingers and lay blame, have suggestions at the ready, such as, right, Workday has a pre-canned termination report. Can we have this automatically distribute every day to the security team and the HR team to make sure we're all on the same page and access has been turned off? Or, right, the entire termination process is managed through the ticketing system. Can we add additional approvals to make sure that the IT leadership is signing off and saying, yes, we disabled this access? And the list goes on and on and on. And if you need assistance, right, anyone on this call needs assistance coming up with solutions for their environment, my partner and I would be happy to give, right, lend a hand and give you some suggestions and, right, pointed feedback on how you can improve in this area. Third, a quote that I've heard a lot over the last 5 years is never let a good crisis go to waste. And unfortunate reality within security and IT budgeting is the executive leadership team will always be apprehensive to spend money until there's a reason to spend it. And a failed audit is typically a very strong catalyst for companies. So right, with that, use this as the opportunity to right the ship, and using the recommendations, identify strategic investments that will help the identity program. So, second question that we need to answer is, should we adopt a framework or just try to go by the letter of the law and go after specific regulations? So, excuse me, I find this to be a funny question because, as we all know, regulations are typically based on other regulations, which are based on other frameworks. It's a big circular pattern. So if you're going to go after FISMA, like Acme Security Services, you're 90% of the way to the NIST cybersecurity framework or 75% of the way to the secure controls framework. Just take the extra step and align your programs to a specific framework. But that being said, right, walking into an executive's office and showing them, here are all the NIST controls, and here's the subsections, and here's all 150 things we need to get done to be NIST compliant, they're going to be incredibly overwhelmed, which is why, right, security teams are compelled to walk in and say, we have 8 metrics to be identity, credential, and access management compliant, and they look like this. Right? We need to have a policy and strategy. And I see we just got a message, and I can answer that now or later, but I will keep going. So The next one being strong authentication mechanism for privileged users, right? These things are very easy to pick off and quantify and qualify for an executive team. But I strongly recommend and cannot state enough that if presented the right way, you can get executive buy-in to a specific framework to improve the programs in a dynamic and maintainable manner. So before I get into specific recommendations, I want to state that I do recommend going after and using frameworks to build together or build out your identity program. I'm not going to recommend anyone in particular because it's hard to give a blanket suggestion. But the NIST cybersecurity framework is very popular, and as such, right, PCI, the Health and Human Services, and many others will publish resources on how to port the cybersecurity framework to meet their requirements. So it is a very good resource. So my first specific recommendation is to map all of your regulatory requirements to the specific framework of your choice. So as I mentioned a couple of times now, CSF isn't a full suite, so you have to go find each individual control that needs to be added. So I strongly recommend holding compliance discussions with internal audit and compliance and all other necessary parties to identify and establish what regulations a company is beholden to. And you all would be incredibly surprised to think that this needs to happen. But I was a security architect at a medical device manufacturer. We had members of the security team who were unaware that we had HIPAA requirements, that we had FDA requirements, that we had PCI requirements. So as funny as it sounds, this sometimes needs to happen, maybe even on a 6-month or yearly basis, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So once this is done and you identify all the regulations, spend the time building out a comprehensive matrix of all the controls you need for your framework and any additional regulations, kind of like the one I have, where it's CSF says identities and credentials are managed. Here's the NIST controls you need to do. Here's the PCI controls you need to do. Check. Number 1's out of the way. Let's move on to number 2, right? And if you're looking for a place to start, because this is overwhelming for a lot of companies, if you literally just Google NIST CSF plus PCI, the first link will get you there, or NIST plus HIPAA, it will get you to both of their resources right off the bat. So the second suggestion is work with internal audit and compliance and perform a gap analysis. So from here on out, I'm going to harp on collaboration and communication until I'm blue in the face, because I firmly believe that the only way security teams can be successful in the long run is if we start acting like we're on the same team with compliance and with audit and the rest of IT. So if the security team is pressing to improve the control landscape, internal audit should be there to help verify, right, the direction we're moving, to assist in the testing, and in general be a sounding board to make sure we're righting the ship correctly. In addition to all of that, right, there is power in numbers. So if HR and compliance and IT, security and audit and the rest of the IT leadership are all identifying gaps together and everything's signed off on, there is power in numbers in getting buy-in from the executive teams who aren't necessarily directly involved with this. So the last thing is, while companies are compelled to go out and just contract a firm to come in and do an analysis, I would argue that companies should always start with a self-assessment like the one NIST provides. It's a great framework and assistance on going through and evaluating yourself without having to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for some consulting company to come in and do the same work using the same documentation. So the final piece of advice for this question is use audit findings, issues, deficiencies to prioritize the work you're doing today and use a framework to shape what you're doing tomorrow. So what I mean is review the findings to establish what needs to be done in the short term. So, right, for example, we have Acme Security that doesn't have an identity management strategy with roles, responsibilities, and stakeholders defined. That means right, in the short run, they need to go build out a policy and have it ratified that, right, establishes their strategy and all of their stakeholders, as opposed to going and hiring a technical writer to do this or buying a policy bundle. You can leverage the cybersecurity framework or secure control framework and leverage their policy and documentation on how to build adequate documentation. So all of this can be done in-house without, right, a huge investment in technical writers. It can be done with your existing teams. Right? So this is an example of what NIST publishes on how to write documentation completely for free without another huge investment. Finally, the last question is my personal favorite because it allows me to just start talking about the stuff I'm truly passionate about, which is how do we go from a 2 to a 4? So a very common problem is companies are stuck in this place where they have policies and procedures defined, they have some ownership across the organization, and they have what looks like could be a very programmatic approach to identity management, but it's reliant on manual procedures, on tickets, on hundreds of man hours to get things done, right? So where do they go from here? And the reason they get to these conclusions that they need to go is one of two things. They found deficiencies and they truly do need to move the needle, or they inherited poor processes and they need to improve them before they pull their hair out. So either reason or combination thereof, or right, any number of hundreds of other reasons to get started, they are all great reasons to start improving your identity program. So our advice is going to sound very redundant at this point, but don't work in a vacuum. Evaluate your processes and work with HR. So the first piece is do not operate in a vacuum. So you should start working with your internal and external auditors, with the greater IT team, and most especially with HR. Say it again, start working with HR. In case you didn't hear me, work with HR and work with HR some more. Because when it comes to the processes and controls, right, without the inclusion of HR, you're doomed to fail. And the reason being, joiners, movers, and leavers, that whole process is heavily dependent on HR. And the reason those processes failed most times is because there's not a strong communication path between HR and IT. And not to mention, close to 90% of identity management is based on the joiner, mover, leaver process. So if there's a breakdown, you're rolling the dice on a breach, material weaknesses, or your job. And if you want a very potent example, go look at Capital One, right? Where a former employee still had access. She logged in, dumped 100 million personal records, and she was able to do this because she was not terminated in a timely manner. So establishing that communication to make sure, even in a manual way, that nobody falls through the cracks, right? Incredibly crucial. Second, for companies, or in a perfect world, companies would be able to take the gap analysis that I've been talking about, go and find a company or platform that fills that perfectly. You just hand it over and say, hey, these are my problems. A company comes in, fixes them. So there's no more risk. It's super cheap, easy to use, and it takes your 3-year roadmap that you've developed and condenses it down to 1 week. Unfortunately, that world doesn't exist. However, there is a unicorn out there that exists without the use of millions of dollars in licensing or thousands of hours of manual work. And it's called automation through scripting. So languages like Python, Perl, Bash, you name it, they're all free to use and free to learn and incredibly powerful. Some of you may roll your eyes and say, zero chance it could be that easy. But I promise you it is. I am by no means a professional developer. I got a degree in cybersecurity, business, and IT management. And I was able to learn Python in 2 to 3 weeks over nights and weekends. Became proficient enough to start automating reporting and processes. So whenever I took over the governance, risk, and compliance program at my former company, we had 15 or 16 SOX controls around our IT general controls. Said that backwards, but exactly 0 of them were automated when I first started. So I was spending hundreds of hours a year working on manual termination reports, user access reviews, separation of duties, right? The list goes on and on. So with my newly found Python skills, I sat down with each one of these controls and identified the gap that was there, which is, for example, our termination processes allowed terminated employees to stay active within systems after their last day, which is probably why I like the NCUA's findings so much, but that's neither here nor there. So, right, after identifying that we obviously cannot make wholesale changes today, I determined that the next best thing is creating a process that can be run in less than 10 to 15 minutes, and it can be run whenever we want. So I sat down and started developing what ultimately became our formal monthly termination process out of Python. It took me a couple of weeks and a lot of Stack Overflow, but it took down the entire process from 40 to 80 hours a month to 15 minutes. We ran this script with all of its documentation through internal and external audit. It got approved, and now that moved the needle a little bit further. So then we sat down one by one and went through each one of these controls and performed similar activities. So we automated our user access reviews, we automated monthly termination, separation of duties, the list goes on and on. And it really took down the workload by over 90% and moved that needle from a 2 to a 3. And finally, right, how did we go from a 3 to a 4? The way to do that, the easiest, fastest, and quickest way to do that is work with HR to build out managed processes through the use of APIs. And I know this is going to sound like I'm throwing away everything I just said, and it kind of is, but for the best reasons. So automating reporting really only moves the needle from a 2 to a 3. But for regulated environments, you got to go from a 3 to a 4, and reporting isn't quite enough. So if we go back to the example with terminations, we've taken these manual controls, these manual general controls, and we've automated it to take exports from the system and do automated correlations and make sure, right, users are disabled. The next step is to use the systems such as Workday and all of the material applications to control the termination process. You do that through the use of APIs and webhooks. So how we have developed this would be, or how I would suggest companies do this, is migrate first from point-in-time reports and exporting things to leveraging APIs to have triggered notifications from the HR application. So anytime anybody is fired, automatically a notification comes through. And then the next step would be, instead of relying on tickets and IT people performing the termination tasks, such as removing entitlements or disabling users, use the API endpoints that are available for automated deprovisioning based on the triggered notifications. And what that may look like are these 2 screenshots from how we have done it in the past. And again, I'm very confident some people are rolling their eyes saying it can't be that easy, right? But it really is. So whenever I was doing the research for this presentation, I was working with my partner on this final section, and his exact words were, give a developer a pack of beer and they'll get all this done in a week. So it truly, especially for people who are developers, and I guarantee you within a security program, at least one person is a hobbyist developer and, right, works with APIs on their free time, they will be able to get at least 80 to 90% of what we're talking about done. So this kind of leads me into the conclusion of what our actual pieces of advice are broken down. So first, don't panic. This isn't the end of the world. It may suck for a little bit, but it's not that bad, and it will get better. Second, use this crisis to improve communication and don't let this go to waste. Lean on a framework, improve and build processes with the help of HR and do it hand in hand and make sure this is done the right way. Automate your manual processes while you can, and then leverage APIs to improve these processes to go from a 3 to a 4. And with that, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for the time.
And Connor, thank you. That was great. I think what would be of interest is maybe some of kind of the anecdotes that you've expressed or that you've experienced are in doing correlations between various systems of records. I didn't say that very well, but effectively, you've got Workday, you've got Active Directory, you've got a number of other systems, and rights and entitlements tend to vary notably from one system to the next. Just as a simple example, one system might show 100 credentials for 100 employees, another one might show 98 or 105. Walk through how you deal with scenarios like that, where you're trying to get to, effectively some defensible ground truth on what is and what isn't in place.
Right. So I'm going to talk more specifically within the context of when I was as the security architect rather than being the CEO of a company that will help with this. But yeah, if you would like to see how we do it in a programmatic way, you can go over to our site, which is claritysecurity.io, and you can see that. But for companies who are looking to do this without heavy investment, what the approach we took was building a SQL database that goes through or Python scripts that first go through and identify all the identities within a specific application. So we would dump all of the users or leverage the APIs to pull in all the users, and then go into each one of the applications and use the same, do the same activity. And then we would go through and identify, all right, here's the unique identifiers that come out of Workday. And you can do correlation through Python scripts to say, all right, well, employee ID number 901438 is Connor, and that's what his identifier is in Workday. Oh, hey, we found that over here in Oracle, and we've had these other identifiers, and we kind of map across the various systems. And for anyone who really wants to see what those Python scripts look like, I'd be happy to distribute them to whomever wants it. But as the accounts are reconciled across the systems, they get added to this single source of truth database, SQL database that can be stored locally, it can be on a server. And as outliers or people who are unable to be identified or found, that triggers notifications. All right, let's go hunt this Connor.r.Borchgrevink, right? So this person who doesn't seem to exist, but maybe is the same person, so go do research on each one of those. But I can guarantee you there's at least some thread in some way to be able to correlate a vast majority of the systems in a meaningful manner, in a programmatic and automated manner.
Excellent. So I know you're on mute, but I'm going to queue you up for a question because, as an auditor that's done a lot of work with public company, when you think about separation of duties, when you think about kind of the administrative overhead, maybe some of the anecdotes that you've experienced in having to kind of go in as an external auditor and kind of opine on credential management practices.
So yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. Just thinking back to what we used to look at, I think SOX audits are maybe a little behind the times, in terms of what the pure requirements are. But what I found was a lot of my customers were struggling in this space, not only keeping their credentials, aligned with security best practices, but also that real correlation of how do we prevent unauthorized access from occurring either from an insider threat perspective, being employees who retain access or their accounts remain active, and also from an external, API exposure perspective. So I think, anecdotally, that's kind of what I saw they were struggling with. And I think, Connor raises some really good points of how we should be thinking about identity and access management.
typically from a audit perspective, how long would your teams have to be kind of engaged to be able to put together a fact pattern on the broader identity and access management program?
So that's a great question. I think it's all situational, but you know, the most challenging thing was always, how do you get a complete and accurate list of you know, users and activity, and kind of build out that fact pattern to determine what may or may not have happened. And a lot of our customers, you know, either didn't have that logging capability or had never had the need to have that level of logging. And so in those cases, if you don't have that information available, you know, in the audit world, that means, you know, we lean a little more conservatively in terms of the findings. So I think a lot of customers could have really benefited from having more logging, which would have maybe brought down the severity of any deficiencies we issued.
Excellent. And Connor, I'm going to cue you up. There was a really good question in the chat from Heinrich about, you know, the notion of human resources, zero trust, kind of the confluence of all this. Would love your insights on this as well.
Yeah. So is it the RBAC in a zero trust environment makes HR unnecessary?
Exactly.
That one? Yeah. So I would agree with, it does make it unnecessary if, right, in a very, very big if, the HR data is perfect, and you can trust everything that kind of exists today. But that, right, that being said, RBAC is incredibly difficult without a system, right? Trying to do this from ground zero on your own would be very, very, very challenging. If you're looking to do true role-based access. So Matt Stamper is a security analyst 1, therefore his role deems he should only get access to these 10 things, but a security analyst 2 should get this. Very difficult. And then in that situation, having HR's involvement is incredibly crucial. Like, maybe in a perfect world, HR's data is perfect, therefore you don't need to communicate back and forth, but I have never found or seen an environment in which that's the case. So the consistent improvement cycle, at least for the first few years until you get to a state where you no longer need HR, right? But I
think, you know, one point, and I'm going to infer some of the items that Heinrich was saying in there, is to a certain extent, identities are becoming the new perimeter. You know, if we think about what an identity allows an individual or a device or an asset to do in the environment, that information should be known, you know, to wit, having greater visibility around how various identities and the roles and entitlements and permissions related to them are managed across the organization.
Right.
And I stand by that.
Okay. I don't disagree with that at all.
Excellent. Let's go ahead and open it up. I know we have to kind of type in the questions into chat or the Q&A, but if there are questions from any of the individuals that are attending today, that would be fantastic. And I don't know, Dave, on your end, if you have any, or Saul, if you want to pester Connor as well, by all means.
Yeah, I'll ask a nice difficult one for Connor. So in systems where role-based access is not possible, you know, what are you seeing, and what are your recommendations for those types of systems, or even in systems where roles are possible, but then you can also assign privileges and permissions discreetly?
Yeah. So speaking through the context of what we do at Clarity Security, we kind of take both into an account, right? So we help build roles out for organizations based on any number of ways. So through using the HR platform. So we have the identity as well as the department role and everything else. So we can help build those roles. But within specific applications, like for example, LastPass, right? They have just all users get the same thing, and there's no way to build a rollout, but you can assign specific privileges, discrete privileges, kind of like you're talking about. So we would treat those, and you should treat those as exceptions. So if something needs to be done, but can't technically be done, right? You should be able to build out a master sheet of exceptions, right? So one of the big things that Saul, you taught me, and Stamper, you taught me, is if there's an exception, it absolutely has to be documented, because just saying you can't do something is not enough, right? And I can remember eating Whataburger and talking to you about this, Saul. So
Yep.
that's right. So taking applications and instances off, treating them holistically, but then also treating specific applications as one-offs and identifying the limitations of each one is incredibly crucial. If you're to go through the work of actually moving the needle from a 1 to a 4 or 2 to a 4, right, you have to be willing to go through the trenches and identify those applications and how you want to deal with them, each one, right? There's no such thing as a silver bullet here. Right? It's going to take work.
Connor, there was actually another question that got posted in the Q&A section from Rich. Have you run into any automation issues, or from a whole grown / intense develop perspective, or vice using an enterprise-wide solution?
Can you ask that one more time? Or I don't know if I see it. It was breaking up a little bit for me.
Sorry, and it's under the Q&A, not the chat. But it was, have you run into any automation issues more from a full-grown / intense develop perspective versus using an enterprise-wide solution?
Yeah. So yes and no. So for companies who have done identity governance or identity management on an enterprise-wide, but that was developed entirely at homegrown. So this is a common thing within universities that have been around forever, and they've had identity programs forever. They build their whole platforms out. The challenges are around how intricate they build these solutions out. So we have some Kerberos server that handles the identities for 5 users that are research professors, right? For example, so obviously those are incredibly difficult to deal with, but it's again the putting in the legwork. But companies who typically use enterprise solutions, the automation is at least much more transparent. So you have a general idea of the connectors that are being used, and if the team is still around that put them in place, it's easier. But for legacy, true legacy environments, it's very common that the people who built it retired 10 years ago, left no documentation. So absolutely, there are troubles and difficulties when it comes to automating legacy environments, but there's various ways to handle that. So some things you just kind of have to accept. We're never going to be able to automate it. For example, if there's a application that lives on a HP UX box that was deployed in 1983, right? And it has no APIs, it has literally nothing. You have to physically log into the box with the specific credentials. Sometimes the best you can do in those cases is open tickets in an automated fashion and bother the admins to verify that it's done, right? So there will be some concessions, and kind of back to my answer to Saul, you have to document those exceptions though. That's key, is documenting the cases in which you can't just drop in a nice, pretty solution or develop
indulge me, you have to document it, but you also have to evidence managerial review and approval over the decision related to it.
Right. Yes, that's what I meant.
Goes without saying.
Yes.
Exactly.
Go
You
to
know, and
the-
I think the emphasis is a little bit of a segue. We have a gentleman that's one of our participants today, Michael Ospitsky, that I used to work with at Gartner. And next month for our July chapter meeting, he's going to be talking about application security and API security. And I was in a talk on app security earlier this week, and you see how things are changing, where a lot of our traditional approaches, legacy approaches, are fundamentally long in the teeth, and they're not going to work as well. And now we're moving into worlds where APIs and algorithms drive everything, but we need to be able to understand how we ingest those APIs, how we validate the results coming from them, and all that. So that'll be a great discussion for our July presentation, just as an aside.
Am I allowed to watch that? Because
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, he's phenomenal. So it'll be an absolutely outstanding discussion. And then we had another one, was exception ownership is another topic altogether, from Patricia. And exactly. Anybody that has solved the grand unifying theory of how to get an executive to accept risk with an actual signature and a date and everything, that person's a miracle worker. So other questions that may be coming in?
I like Michael's message. No heckling. I can't promise.
Exactly. And to Patricia's point again, this is kind of rarefied earth in a lot of ways, a rarefied area. Credential management is every bit as challenging for most security programs today as is third-party risk and vendor management. These are the two underbellies, from my view, from a CISO perspective, on where security tends to fall down fairly quickly. And I think, Connor, to your point, not only just from a technological perspective, but from a methodological perspective, which is most important, get the methodology down first and then automate it. This can be solved. It's like ransomware. Ransomware doesn't need to be a scourge. It is, because we don't patch systems and we don't really do appropriate security evaluation and testing, and we make it easy for the adversaries to impact our environments, or in this case, we make it easy for an auditor to come in and find either significant deficiencies or material weaknesses around it when they really shouldn't be. So I think we had a few more comments coming in here.
And to Heinrich's point, and all the comments on exceptions, we completely agree. That's why in the platform, right, we built exception management was one of the very first things that we built in, is because I know the pain of trying to get a CEO to sign off and say, yeah, we're going to accept the risk that we don't know how to terminate people in a timely manner. And we also view that there's no such thing as a permanent risk acceptance. Something should not be, we're just going to sign this off for the next 50 years and we'll deal with it 50 years from now. Everything is time limited, right? All exceptions expire and you have to revalidate. We're going to make you click the button, sign your name, and state that Matt Stamper deserves this exception, or this application deserves this exception. So I could not agree more with everything Heinrich is saying, and Patricia and you, Stamper and Saul, like that. Yes, it is an incredibly difficult problem.
But it's solvable, you know.
Yeah.
If we can put people up on the moon, I think we can solve credential management. So
You'd think that.
Excellent. Connor, sir, thank you very much. I don't think we have any other questions coming in, but this was absolutely fantastic presentation, very informative. I loved, as an aside, just the background on kind of FISMA and the status of some of those FCEBs, that federal or civilian executive branch agencies, and some of the status of those. It does speak volumes to the work that needs to be done. So great job today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.
And again, we look forward to our July meeting, and we'll be talking a lot about API security, but again, great job.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Take care.
Thanks. Bye.